Hello and welcome back to Equity, TechCrunch's flagship podcast about the business of startups. I'm Rebecca Balan, and this is the episode where we bring on industry experts to help us explore a trend in the tech world and dive deep. Today, we're bringing you a live conversation from TechCrunch Disrupt 2025, where senior reporter Dominic-Madori Davis sat down with January Ventures co-founder and general partner Jennifer Neundorfer. The two talked about how early-stage investing is changing in the age of AI, what it takes to spot founders building beyond Silicon Valley, and why expanding networks can uncover the next generation of breakout companies. Let's take a listen.
Hello. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for coming on the pod and coming for TechCrunch Disrupt this year. Before we dive right into questions, can you just tell our audience a little bit about you and your work?
Yeah, Dom, thanks for having me. It's great to be here at Disrupt, and it's great to sit down with you. At January Ventures, we invest primarily at the pre-seed in software companies for legacy industries. So we do a lot in healthcare, supply chain and manufacturing, climate, energy transition, think tech to very traditional industries. And we started January because we felt that there was just a lot of friction at the early stage around that first check. And so, one of the reasons I appreciate sitting down with you is we are committed at January to demystifying the early stages of venture, and TechCrunch and Equity and you have been such great partners in doing that. So it's great to sit down.
Yeah, that goes to, I guess, my first question of what are some misconceptions people still have about fundraising, especially at the pre-seed level?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things that has changed at the pre-seed level in, this current wave of AI, which I know we'll get into, is that founders are able to do a lot more with less. And so when I think about what we were seeing at the pre-seed 5 years ago, where often it was someone who had an idea, hadn't necessarily built anything, didn't have their product yet, had no revenue. Today, what we're seeing is founders who they might not yet have revenue, but they've actually gone out and built something and they're able to get further along. And I think it's important for founders because what they're able to do is really validate the idea before they go out and raise money and commit to it. And so what we're seeing are founders who just have a few more proof points at the pre-seed stage.
How has being an early stage investor changed given all the recent changes in the market the past few years? I'm thinking of course, with AI and everything, but how has just the past few years been? How has it changed for you?
Well, I would say everyone is pitching an AI company. And so to a certain extent, a lot of the pitches start to sound the same. But it is exciting because AI is changing not only what companies are built, but also how companies are built. And so that's a big thing that we are focused on is not only what is the AI native product that is being built and do we think that's defensible and all of that, but are these founders that are actually building with AI in the DNA of their company? And how does that change their capital efficiency? How does it change how they go to market? And so that's a huge shift that we are seeing in the past 2 years. And then as a firm, we're also thinking about how do we leverage AI to be more efficient, more effective? How does that change the team that we build? And so we're trying to, in the same way that we're asking companies, how are they changing to adopt and adapt in the same way as a firm?
Yeah. Has your firm started using AI for anything?
Yeah, we actually went through a process earlier this year to just play with a lot of tools and create the sandbox to figure out what would really move the needle for us and then build some custom instances so that we could leverage them. And, what we do is such a person-to-person business at the early stage and at pre-seed. Yes, we're evaluating products and markets, but I'm really evaluating people. And so there's only so much that AI can do there. But on the diligence associated with a market and competition, there's a lot that AI can do. And then just on the operations of our firm, how do we do things as mundane as managing portfolio updates and leveraging AI for investor communications? And so that is a place where it has certainly made us more efficient.
What do you think is a category that's kind of prime for disruption that hasn't been disrupted yet? Of course, I'm thinking, again, with the AI sense, but just maybe in general.
Well, as I mentioned, we are focused on traditional industries, and a place where we are spending more and more time is on healthcare, just because there is such a huge gap between the supply and demand of people in healthcare and healthcare providers. And we are looking at ways where, certainly I don't think that we're at the point where AI is going to deliver healthcare, but how can AI make the current healthcare staff much more effective so that they can focus on serving patients instead of doing all of the back office. And so, that's a place where the hurdles are high to build AI in healthcare. And there's things that those companies need to prove out more than, let's say, AI for retail. But it's a place where we are spending a lot of time because the companies that can crack that are proving to be very sticky.
Yeah, I guess on the similar note of just what is the most exciting use case you've seen of AI in the past maybe year?
There's so many, and there's so many that, are like simple application layers that like just actually don't get me excited. Where I tend to get excited, Dom, is when I see someone who is using AI to do something that isn't 10x better. It's actually to create a whole new experience or workflow or behavior. And, we do primarily B2B. And so it's thinking about not just like, how do we make a sales process or the reporting process somewhat more efficient? It's about how do we make an individual contributor actually do what a manager is doing or things like that. So that's what we're looking at is, less of the incremental changes and more totally new behaviors.
Do you think that there is a time in the near future where there will be AI fatigue?
I think it's already here.
You think it's already here?
I mean, I'd say we're in a moment where there is both enthusiasm and excitement for very good reason, but I also think there is fatigue.
What are people tired of?
So my first internship in venture, and this will date myself, was in the summer of 2000 when we were at the height of the dot-com boom, right? Just right before it crashed. And I convinced a venture capitalist to let me come work for them. And I had it was right after my freshman year in college. I had no marketable skills, but they were like, you can help us plan our AGM and you can help us shred paper. And at the time, every company was like noun.com, right? That was the name of every company. And I think to a certain extent, I see real similarities today. It is the rare case that we are meeting with a founder who is not pitching some AI-enabled product. And so the fatigue there is just around which of these companies are actually really differentiated and which should exist. And, for me, again, back to like those new behaviors that AI is enabling, there's just fatigue when all of the ideas start to sound the same. And so where I think founders are breaking through is when they can communicate to investors why what they're doing is really different than the other dozens of startups that are doing that and why they are the team to go after that. And that's a lot of where our diligence is focusing on is like the why behind the team. And do we think that's compelling?
Yeah, we're actually going to talk about that in our panel later on today in terms of how can these companies stand out. Something I did want to ask on the same note of AI fatigue is, I know it might be a little bit early, but so does that mean there's probably definitely an AI bubble coming? And if so, what do you think the winners of this moment will look like?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that there will be a correction and, there's so much capital going into AI right now. And I don't think that all of the companies that get started will end up surviving. But the companies that I think will navigate this moment and build truly category defining companies in the future are ones that can build to where the tech is going. The thing that is so different about AI versus other technical waves is that the adoption and the cycles are happening so much faster. Even if we're getting to know a company, if they're building for where the tech is today, it's actually likely that what they're building will be obsolete in 3 months when new models are released. And so founders who can stay ahead of that curve, build at the edge of like what's possible today and build for what is coming. And then also, Dom, I think founders who are able to really read the market and understand what it is that their customer wants versus just building what is possible. And so, those are the founders that I think will have an advantage and really will be building the lasting companies.
Yeah, that kind of goes into my next question, which was about the traits you look for. What are the characteristics of a founder that you like to, work with?
Yeah, it's where we spend most of our time during our diligence. We need to believe that a founder can build and really generate momentum around their idea. They have to be a founder or a founding team that can build the idea. And obviously, AI is changing what that looks like as there are more tools to help founders build on the technical side. But they also have to be able to sell it. And I made the mistake early on in my career of backing some founders who were just deeply technical, but couldn't ever sell. And we need founders who can sell to customers, can sell to investors, can sell and recruit top talent and really evangelize what they're building. The one trait that I would say that we are now over-indexing on a bit more in this AI wave are founders who have deep market expertise and really understand their customer and who they're building for. I think right now it's moats in the AI era are sort of up for grabs right now. We're all trying to figure out what is defensible long term. And I think what's interesting about this moment is that things like market expertise, a network of customers to sell to, real insight into what the UI, UX will look like for that product are actually winning out and creating some really interesting moats. And so that's something that we try to assess in our diligence.
What do you look for in a founding team? This is a kind of a two-part question. What do you look for in a founding team? And with the way AI is going, would you invest in kind of like a one-person team where AI does the rest of the work and then you have like a CEO founder?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, would we invest in a solo founder? And we have invested in solo founders. It's the rare exception where it's a solo founder with no one else
Yeah.
on the team. But it is interesting to think about. When I see someone who hasn't brought anyone else into their idea, my question is like, can they bring in top talent? And so I think I may be hesitant if someone has no one on their team, but a couple people leveraging AI, I think is really interesting. And actually, one of our most recent investments is a company that has gotten really far with just two people because of that efficiency. And when we look at teams, a lot of it comes down, if it is a founding team with multiple founders, it's like, what is the relationship between those people? A lot of the people we're looking at, they have a lot of opportunity costs. What was it that brought them together? And why do we think that will be not only a productive partnership now, but enduring for the future? Because the biggest risk for us is that that founding team doesn't work out and becomes a distraction. And so we really want teams that can endure.
What is one thing you would tell a non-AI company fundraising right now? Like, what is advice you would give them in terms of standing out to investors like yourself?
Yeah, it's a relevant question because so many companies raised a lot of capital in the end of the last cycle before everyone was an AI company. My biggest piece of advice, Dom, would be figure out how to embed AI into your operations and sort of, even if your product isn't an AI product, how do you become an AI native company just culturally and operationally? And one of the things that we did recently was we did a survey of how company building is changing in the age of AI. And we actually included companies that were started in 17, 18, 19 and looked at what they are doing to reorient themselves. And I think it has to come from the top. What we have found is that startups can't just say, we've hired this team and they're going to be the ones that disseminate AI. It actually really has to come from the leadership team, beginning to use it, beginning to understand its capabilities, knowing what best in class looks like, and then filtering that down.
Something I actually wanted to talk about, because there's been a lot of shifts in the market, but something that, I don't know, is kind of a question mark right now is a lot of what's been happening with DEI. And so I definitely wanted to ask, like, what is the state of DEI right now within venture capital? And how are underrepresented founders doing in this environment?
Well, I love this question. And one answer is I will tell you what we're seeing now. And then also, we do an annual research report of early stage founders. And we look at a lot, how company building is changing, what the market looks like, but we also look at how underrepresented founders feel in that. So there'll be an update early next year once we have that data. But yeah, there has been a pullback from DEI. And what I will say is I still see people supporting underrepresented founders, and they may be using different language to do that, and they may be working with different partners to do that. I do still think that work is being done. But I also think it highlights that some of the work that was being done was at a very superficial layer. And so programs that maybe were supporting early stage founders that were underrepresented or funds that were supporting underrepresented founders, a lot of those have not been renewed. And so, I think when we look at that, that's disappointing, but it actually is just a huge opportunity. Like at January, we look at where are the capital dislocations. And that is a huge dislocation where when you look at the data, underrepresented founders are outperforming and they are underfunded. And so we just see it as a huge opportunity that we and others are excited to fill, but it is disappointing to see the market pull back.
And I know that you are a mentor. And so what are you telling founders right now who might be nervous or worried about their companies and operating in the VC world given the pullback?
Yeah, it's really hard because a lot of this they can't control. But I think the first piece is just like almost don't worry about all of the noise. And when we work with underrepresented founders, like a lot of it is just reinforcing that if they put their heads down and build a great company, then they have the metrics to support that story. Then we and others can help them tell that story, make warm introductions, plug them into the capital stack to get that funding. But first and foremost, just ignoring the noise around the market and building a great company. I think that's my biggest piece of advice because anything else becomes something that they can't control and the worry almost isn't worth it. But I understand where it comes from.
Yeah. And I have one more DEI question, which is mostly that why have funding levels for like women and a lot of minority groups kind of stayed the same even over the past few years, even with much like awareness? Why has it still stayed the same?
It's such a good question. And part of why we founded January is because we saw that these funding levels were so low, yet we saw founders in our network that were underrepresented building the next generation of venture scalable businesses. I think a lot of it, Dom, comes down to networks. When we started January, it was on the insight that we couldn't take the network out of venture. It's how we source companies. It's how we underwrite risk. But we did think we could build a venture fund on a fundamentally different network and sort of change who was getting that funding. And networks take time to change. And so, what we saw in, let's say, like 18, 19, with a lot of initiatives to fund female founders or diverse founders or underrepresented founders, a lot of people said, like, it's done. We've solved the funding gap. But as you pointed out, the numbers remain. And so I think it demonstrates that these things are slow to change. Even as people are putting more capital to work to fund these founders, it's going to take time for those networks to change.
And I actually wanted to talk to you about the rewriting networks thing, because one, I wanted to ask, what does that mean and how have you done it?
Yeah. So we did it by just at the beginning, just blocking and tackling and getting people into our network. But what we realized as two female GPs was that we had a really different network than our male counterparts. And so that's where it started. Actually, Dom was just looking around and realizing that we had this network. As we built January, we've obviously put in place the process to grow that network, refresh, sort of go beyond just the people that my partner Marin and I knew. But it's really been about leaning into the diversity and the differentiation of our network and building around that. So we have an operator network of 100 execs in the tech and corporate world. And a lot of funds have operator networks, but when you look at the makeup of our network, it feels really different than the networks that our founders are a part of in other aspects. And then it comes from the founders that we invest in and the flywheel that begins to produce. And what we hear from our founders is that they can show up as their true full self to the January network in a way that they can't to some of the other networks that they're a part of in tech. And that's sort of how we measure, like, is this network manifesting and are we seeing that flywheel grow?
I wanted to talk a bit about your not personal life, but your life before being a VC. But first, where are you based again?
I'm based in Boston.
You're based in Boston. Okay, because I was going to ask you a question about San Francisco and how it's coming back. Or is it coming back?
Well, so my partner Marin and I met at Stanford Business School. So we spend a lot of time out here. This is where our roots were. We both started our careers as operators here in San Francisco and in Silicon Valley. And so, it's been interesting to see like the waxing and waning of San Francisco. And I think that's part of its history. And it is exciting to see that San Francisco feels like it is back. And we see companies in Boston that are coming through that maybe we fund them early, but they want to come to San Francisco to build because they're like deep in the AI infrastructure layer. And that makes sense. What I think is interesting is that as San Francisco has come back, it is coming back around a specific set of AI companies. And as we look with a broader geographic lens, what we're seeing is that at the application layer, there's really interesting pockets of activity that are not in San Francisco. And in part, it's back to that point that I mentioned where I think to succeed building an enduring application layer company, you need to have real experience and expertise in that industry. And a lot of the people that have that, like, they aren't located here in Silicon Valley. And so there's this interesting marriage between some of the infrastructure layer being built here and then the application layer being built in other geographies. If you're building for supply chain and ag, you actually might be in the Midwest because you have been in that space and really understand that customer. If you're building in fashion, retail, probably going to be in New York. And so what we're looking at is like, where does it make sense for some of these companies to be built because there is that legacy expertise?
I know one of my favorite things is my friend has an AI fashion company. And I was like, well, why aren't you in San Francisco building? And she was like, fashion, Dominic, I have to be in New York.
Yeah.
She's like, they're in New York.
And that's where their customers are.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, because I was going to ask, like, what are the other hot markets aside from San Francisco and New York? Obviously, I'm a little biased. But
Well, and, I'll give a selfish plug for Boston because the reason that I'm there is because there is so much talent that is coming through Boston. And unlike Stanford and Silicon Valley and San Francisco, where there's just everything is so entwined, Boston has just more silos and isn't as much in that flow. And so it's been a great place for us to be to source early stage founders and, fund them to either stay in Boston or go to New York because they're in retail and that's where they should be, but to really help them find that capital early and reduce friction around that first check.
how are the southern markets doing? I know they kind of had a moment during the pandemic.
Yeah.
How are they doing?
Well, like one market that I think is really interesting is the Research Triangle down in North Carolina, right? Where there's like real deep expertise. Particularly, I mentioned we were looking in healthcare and there's some really interesting companies there. We're seeing a bunch in DC as well. I think defense tech, security, and also companies realizing that regulation is a place that startups just don't understand as much and actually do need to understand more and are trying to put someone on the ground in DC to better enmesh themselves on the regulatory side.
Yeah, I know the whole policy thing has been funny to see startups realize that they have to
Yeah.
understand
Yeah, they don't
that.
exist in a vacuum.
Yeah, they don't exist in the vacuum. I wanted to ask some questions about your life before venture because you were at YouTube and 21st
Yeah.
Century Fox. Super cool. What did you learn at those two companies that impacted your approach toward helping companies build? Like, what did you learn there?
I was lucky enough to be at YouTube in the early days right after Google purchased YouTube. And I was on the monetization team. So we sort of came in and said, like, we're going to make money. And at that point, we did not make any money. So it was a huge cultural shift. And I think my biggest learning there was really around incentives. So we had advertisers that wanted to be on YouTube. We had launched the first ad unit that was called Promote Your Video, and it ran alongside the video player. But the Google ad sales force had no incentive to sell our product. And so it just was this really interesting learning for me that of the complexities of large organizations. And that translates to working with our startups because they may say, like, I've got a champion and they want to buy this product and they want to do a pilot. But then it's like really helping them think through what are the incentives in that larger organization, particularly for enterprise sales, to say, okay, how do you convert a champion to actually getting this approved by the CFO or things like that, which, again, it takes a few levels of abstraction.
Yeah, wait, why didn't they want to sell the...
They had no quota against it. So when we first launched it, their clients would say like, oh, what's going on at YouTube? Like, can we buy over there? And they had no financial incentive. All of their quotas were for AdWords. And so they just...
It's so funny to look back now and say like, it's so funny.
I know. Well, and that's it. I mean, so much has changed, right? And same thing at 21st Century Fox. When I was there, we did the Hulu joint venture, the MySpace acquisition, digital sports nets, mobile broadcasting networks. And I think there actually, Dom, the interesting insight was just how to think about innovation and stay ahead of the curve. When I was there, we built Hulu. We were trying to get the rights that we as Fox owned to come to Hulu. And it was like pulling teeth, right? We just couldn't get them.
Wow.
And the organization was still focused on cable subscribers, and the cord cutting story really wasn't in the numbers yet, but we knew that's where it was going. And so, to bring it back to today, that analogy of how do companies build to what's coming rather than the state of play today?
What was the transition like going from working at these companies to then becoming a VC?
What I learned was that, and I learned this at Fox, like, so much of what I did was meet with people who had great technology who were like, this is going to change how we produce content and how we watch TV and consume content. And I loved that part of the job. I loved when we were thinking about the early stages and how to commercialize something. I actually didn't care as much when we were like, should the marketing team at Hulu be 50 or 60 people? Like, that was an important decision, but I didn't really care. And so that's when I realized that I loved working with founders at the early stage. But I also knew I wasn't a founder. My husband is a founder. So I knew that that was just not in my DNA. And I'd learned enough about myself to know that I loved making connections between different ideas and different experiences. And so that has served me really well as an investor. But it was hard because as an investor, I'm not operating. And so I may have really strong views about what should happen, but I need to convince founders of that. I need to use influence. I need to be comfortable trusting the founders that we work it with to make the best decisions and, resisting the urge to get in there and do it myself.
What is one early hurdle you remember, like in your early days of being an investor? What's like an early challenge you remember going through that maybe now you look back on and it's kind of funny, but like in the beginning, it was like, this is awful.
Oh my gosh, so many things. I feel like the investor learning curve is steep. So, I mentioned one thing of just like learning that I needed to invest in founders that were commercial. And then the other was just around finding my style around working with founders. Like, I remember in the early days, I felt like I needed to check in with founders all the time and like document everything and like really have all of this long input and, weigh in on like the specifics of the business. And that's appropriate for some cases, but it really is about more like the relationship with the founder. Not only weighing in on the business, but supporting them as a person, which was just funny because I felt like I was so tactically focused in the beginning. I felt like I always had to be doing something with them. And I realized like that may be important if that's what the company needs in that moment. But just as important is supporting them as a person, making sure that on this roller coaster that is being a founder, they have what they need to be successful.
What was the process like of narrowing down the thesis you wanted to focus in?
When Maren and I started talking about January, we spent a lot of time going through the motions there. We hired a leadership facilitator to just help us pressure test our partnership and have some of these conversations around our focus and where we wanted to be. But then we actually, Dom, approached it, as operators starting a firm, we approached it much like you would bringing a product to market. And so, once we had an idea of where we thought the opportunity was, we brought it out there and started to see if there was pull for our product. And so we started with a small proof of concept fund to really make sure that what we were bringing to the market had pull from top founders. And that's when we began to scale from there.
I only have time for a few more questions. I want to talk to you about your work as a mentor, because you're with Somos VC and I believe Techstars too.
Yeah.
How has the role of a mentor changed over the past few years? Has it at all? I'm wondering, what are companies asking for now that might have been different a few years ago?
I do a lot of mentorship because part of it's like paying it forward. There were so many people that were helpful to me. One of the things that I'm seeing, it's less of what the companies are asking for, but what I'm seeing in the people that I am mentoring is just a feeling that the world feels more uncertain now.
What ways?
Whether it is at the macro level and the geopolitical level, or just what does AI mean for my career? And so I'll mentor a lot of people who are looking to get into venture. It's well, will there even be entry-level jobs in venture? So, I've focused a lot on just how do people continue to make themselves marketable? What is the zone of influence that they can really succeed in and shine in, rather than trying to figure out what other people want? What is it that they're passionate about and where can they stand out? Because regardless of where AI goes, I think we will still continue to index and pull from people that really stand out. And we have an internship program ourselves. And it's been interesting, much of that is to help people get their foot in the door in venture. And we've had now about 15 venture fellows. And what's great is 2/3 of them now have full-time jobs in venture. So that's also been really gratifying as a way to, again, change that network in venture.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting. I never thought, because I hear about it in banking in terms of is AI going to replace all the junior bankers? Or is there a world where AI replaces the junior analyst at a firm?
I don't think so. I think it may do parts of the job that an associate does. AI does a pretty good job with competitive research to a certain extent, but AI can't go out and meet a founder, at least today. And I think for junior people in venture, for all of us in venture, where we got our edge is how do we meet people first? How do we create that relationship so that they want to work with us? And I haven't seen an AI that's able to do that yet, but if you have one, let me know, because then that is job insecurity for us venture capitalists.
Job insecurity. Yeah, I actually think that's all we have time for today. But thank you so much for such an amazing conversation. Thanks
Thanks,
for coming.
Tom. This was a great conversation.